They cast her out in the dark. They buried her truth beneath forged documents and golden lies. But they forgot one thing: fire remembers the hand that struck it first. In this haunting tale of exile, deception, and rising from ruin, Alina Virel returns to the world that tried to erase her, not for power, not for pity, but for justice. And in the end, she finds something even greater: peace. This is The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, a story of quiet rage, blooming resilience, and the long road home. The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, Chapter 1. The exiled child. The night she left, no one cried, no one dared, for in that silence, the kingdom forgot her name, but she remembered every scar. It was always colder on the edge of the kingdom, beyond the reach of royal carriages and courtiers' whispers. Past the frostbitten hills and forgotten chapels lay a modest convent built of stone and silence. It sat like a relic from another age, gray walls wrapped in ivy, cloisters echoing only the chants of women who no longer expected the world to remember them. Among them was a girl who never truly belonged there. They called her Sister Leora. She answered to it with the obedience of someone who had learned not to argue with fate. She woke before dawn, knelt through prayers she no longer believed in, and worked her hands raw in the garden's black soil. Her voice was gentle, her presence like the hush before snowfall, but behind her calm eyes lay something unsaid, a name not spoken in years, a grief that had grown old with her. Leora had hair the color of midnight, always braided neatly, as the Mother Superior required, and eyes the shade of old gold eyes that once had known chandeliers, not candle smoke, satin sheets, not linen patched and rough. But in the convent, such things were not spoken. There were no mirrors, no gowns, and certainly no talk of past lives. Still, every winter, on the same night, she would rise from bed while the others slept, wrap herself in her threadbare cloak, and stand barefoot on the cold stone balcony. She'd stare out into the dark woods, as though waiting for something or someone that never came. No one ever asked why. No one knew that this night, 13 years ago, was the night her world was burned down. But tonight, something changed. As the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a scent not native to this place: smoke, but not of firewood. Leora's hand curled tighter around the edge of her cloak. A letter had arrived that morning, unsigned, tucked inside a delivery of dried herbs. Just 7 words: he never died. He was silenced. She hadn't eaten since. The next day, Leora's tasks were performed with mechanical grace. She did not tremble. She did not ask questions. But something inside her had awakened. For the first time in years, she looked in the cracked glass near the wash basin, as if searching for a face she once wore. And in the dead of night, when the moon hung low like a secret, she packed a bundle of herbs, a small pouch of coins she'd been hiding beneath the floorboards, and the old pendant stitched into the hem of her habit, a pendant shaped like a falcon, crest of a house that no longer existed, or so they thought. She didn't say goodbye. She simply vanished, the way a ghost would, quiet, forgotten, but never gone. If you're still here, you're meant to hear this story. Not everyone survives exile, but some come back stronger. Some return not to beg, but to reclaim. If you believe in the fire hidden beneath ashes, subscribe to From Ashes to Power. Your presence helps this voice rise again. The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, Chapter 1. The exiled child. The night she left, no one cried, no one dared, for in that silence, the kingdom forgot her name, but she remembered every scar. It was always colder on the edge of the kingdom, beyond the reach of royal carriages and courtiers' whispers. Past the frostbitten hills and forgotten chapels lay a modest convent built of stone and silence. It sat like a relic from another age, gray walls wrapped in ivy, cloisters echoing only the chants of women who no longer expected the world to remember them. Among them was a girl who never truly belonged there. They called her Sister Leora. She answered to it with the obedience of someone who had learned not to argue with fate. She woke before dawn, knelt through prayers she no longer believed in, and worked her hands raw in the garden's black soil. Her voice was gentle, her presence like the hush before snowfall, but behind her calm eyes lay something unsaid, a name not spoken in years, a grief that had grown old with her. Leora had hair the color of midnight, always braided neatly, as the Mother Superior required, and eyes the shade of old gold eyes that once had known chandeliers, not candle smoke, satin sheets, not linen patched and rough. But in the convent, such things were not spoken. There were no mirrors, no gowns, and certainly no talk of past lives. Still, every winter, on the same night, she would rise from bed while the others slept, wrap herself in her threadbare cloak, and stand barefoot on the cold stone balcony. She'd stare out into the dark woods, as though waiting for something or someone that never came. No one ever asked why. No one knew that this night, 13 years ago, was the night her world was burned down, but tonight, something changed. As the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a scent not native to this place. Smoke, but not a firewood. Leora's hand curled tighter around the edge of her cloak. A letter had arrived that morning, unsigned, tucked inside a delivery of dried herbs. Just 7 words. He never died. He was silenced. She hadn't eaten since. The next day, Leora's tasks were performed with mechanical grace. She did not tremble. She did not ask questions. But something inside her had awakened. For the first time in years, she looked in the cracked glass near the wash basin, as if searching for a face she once wore. And in the dead of night, when the moon hung low like a secret, she packed a bundle of herbs, a small pouch of coins she'd been hiding beneath the floorboards, and the old pendant stitched into the hem of her habit, a pendant shaped like a falcon, crest of a house that no longer existed, or so they thought. She didn't say goodbye. She simply vanished, the way a ghost would, quiet, forgotten, but never gone. If you're still here, you're meant to hear this story. Not everyone survives exile, but some come back stronger. Some return not to beg, but to reclaim. If you believe in the fire hidden beneath ashes, subscribe to From Ashes to Power. Your presence helps this voice rise again, absolutely. Here is Chapter 3 of The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, written in English, with richer detail, deeper introspection, and refined emotional pacing, continuing Alina's journey as she leaves the convent behind and begins to craft a new identity in the outside world. Chapter 3, Return of the Nameless. The world may not remember your name, but it remembers your blood. The road was not paved. It wound like an old scar through the skeletal trees, flanked by frost-laced heather and silence. Alina had not spoken a word since dawn. The chill of early spring clung to her hem and her breath, but she barely noticed. Silence had long been her companion ever since the night they stripped her of her name, her future, and the warmth of belonging. But today, silence felt different. It was no longer a prison. It was pause before motion, the kind that came before a storm. Her feet ached in the thin leather slippers that weren't made for travel. Her cloak had holes, the kind that grew over years of mending and wearing thin. But in her pocket, hidden inside a fold of coarse fabric, was the pendant. Cold against her skin, the silver falcon, the last trace of House Virel. She had no plan, only a direction. South, toward the capital, toward the place they told her she could never return. By the second night, the wind turned cruel. Alina found shelter in an abandoned chapel by the roadside. The roof was caving in and the pews rotted, but the altar still stood. There, huddled beside a crumbling stone wall, she wrapped her arms around herself and whispered for the first time in years, "I'm not done. I never was." And something deep within her stirred like coals that had never truly gone cold. She reached the outpost town of Viarden on the 5th day, weak from hunger and windburn. It was little more than a cluster of homes, a crooked inn, and a marketplace that reeked of boiled turnips and old leather. Alina kept her eyes low, pulling the hood forward as she moved through the crowd, but as fate would have it, someone recognized her, not by her face, but by the pendant that had slipped from her collar as she stumbled into the apothecary stall. A hand caught her wrist before she could flee. "Where did you get that?" the man asked, his voice low, not threatening, surprised, almost reverent. She looked up sharply. He was old, perhaps 60, with a long scar down his right jaw and eyes that had seen too much. He wore a faded cloak, and there was nothing noble about his appearance except for the way he watched her, as if searching for a ghost he'd once sworn to protect. "You have the eyes," he whispered, "like your mother's." Lady Mavel. Alina froze. No one had said her mother's name aloud in over a decade, not even she dared to. The man stepped back slowly, his hands raised. "Forgive me, I was their steward. I served your father for 30 years until the night of the fire. I believed you were dead." "I nearly was," Alina said, her voice hoarse. "But someone decided I was easier to erase than to kill." They sat in the back room of the man's modest home, hidden from the eyes of the street. His name was Garin. He had escaped the night the Virel estate burned, carrying nothing but a ledger and his loyalty. Since then, he'd lived as a merchant, watching from the fringes of power, waiting for something to change. I don't have proof, Alina confessed. Only whispers and that letter. And this pain in my chest that won't go away. You don't need proof, Garen said gently. You need a face they don't recognize, a name they won't suspect, and time. That night, by candlelight, they began. The old steward cut her hair not drastically, but enough to frame her face differently. He gave her new clothes, a traveling gown of deep navy, elegant but modest, stitched with northern patterns. Then, he pulled out a trunk worn but intact. Inside were papers, names, titles, old alliances. You'll be Lady Aurelia of Northfold, he said, daughter of a lost line from the coastal nobility. I've used the title before, to secure trade routes. It won't raise suspicion. Alina touched the sigil stitched into the cloak, a silver fern on black, and the pendant. She asked, keep it close, Garen said, but never visible. It's your truth, not your weapon. Not yet. Before she left, he gave her a small dagger, nothing ornate, but sharp. For protection, he said, but in his eyes, she saw something deeper. Resolve. You remind me of your father, he told her. He was gentle but never soft. When they pushed, he yielded, but when they tried to break him, he rose. Alina swallowed. They broke him anyway. Yes, Garen said, but now, you rise. If you're reading this, you believe in stories that refuse to stay buried. Alina's name was taken, her home destroyed, but she walks forward not as a ghost, but as a storm. Subscribe to From Ashes to Power and follow her journey. The past may be ashes, but the future, oh, the future is fire. I'm so glad you're enjoying the journey. Here's the next chapter of The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, continuing the rich, emotional, and suspenseful tone you love. Chapter 4. The Puppet Duchess. Power wears many faces, but none more dangerous than the smiling mask of those who stole it. The capital had changed. Alina stood at the edge of the bridge that arched like a ribcage over the river Calum, staring at the skyline of a city that once belonged to her childhood dreams. The towers were taller now, the flags different, but the air sharp with coal smoke and lavender oil was still the same. It smelled like memory. She pulled the hood of her cloak lower and stepped onto the bridge, her heels echoing with each step. Beneath her, the waters churned with the secrets of 1,000 years, royal births, noble betrayals, and silenced truths like hers. She wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here to haunt those who had forgotten her name. The city gate guards didn't question Lady Aurelia of Northfold. Garen's documents were flawless, stamped with an obscure sigil from a noble coastal house that no longer existed, thanks to a long-forgotten war. Her carriage, borrowed from a loyal tradesman, was aged but clean. Her accent was studied, just northern enough to sound exotic, just polished enough to suggest education. The nobles would sniff her blood, searching for cracks in her pedigree. So she gave them a myth, one born of distance, sea storms, and quiet tragedy. They lapped it up. Within a week, she had attended her first salon, hosted by the ever-charming Countess Vale. It was a gathering of silk and vanity rooms filled with gilded laughter and poisoned smiles. Alina moved through it like smoke, soft-spoken, observant, invisible by design. Her gown was midnight blue, her gloves elbow length, her mask, a gentle smile and downcast eyes. But beneath it, her mind was a blade. She learned quickly. Lord Farron had debts he covered with borrowed glory. Lady Emmeline hated her younger sister for marrying richer. And Duke Theron, the very man who sat at her father's right hand, who had given the eulogy at their false funeral, was now chancellor, a puppet with a golden tongue and blood on his hands. She didn't flinch when he approached. Lady Aurelia, he said smoothly, taking her gloved hand. I've heard whispers. Northfold, is it? I recall your house, small but proud. Was your father Admiral Cilia's? She tilted her head, letting just the right hesitation bloom in her eyes. Yes. She lied softly. He died when I was a child. My mother passed the year after. The lie was almost true, and that made it powerful. Duke Theron smiled, believing her as only the guilty do. My condolences. The sea is never kind to its children. No, she said, her voice calm, but it does not forget them. He chuckled, unaware of the edge in her words. Later that night, in the privacy of her rented quarters, Alina opened the tiny velvet notebook Garen had given her. Each page was a piece of a puzzle. Names, alliances, betrayals. She added her notes: new players, old ghosts, and one truth that burned. They had rebuilt this kingdom on the bones of her family, but no structure, no matter how beautiful, could stand forever on blood-soaked foundations, not when one of the ghosts had returned to walk among them, and so began the dance. Alina flattered the wives, endured the court poets, memorized the gossip. She became a mystery to be solved, a jewel from the north that no one had heard of but everyone wanted to possess. But while they tried to decode her, she was watching, mapping, hunting, because somewhere beneath all this lace and laughter was the one who ordered her parents' deaths, and when she found them, they wouldn't even see her coming. Power stolen can be worn like silk but never cleansed of blood. Alina has entered the game. Her silence is not submission, it is strategy. Subscribe to From Ashes to Power and witness how a forgotten girl becomes a force they will never forget. I'm thrilled you're loving it. It's about to get even more intense. Here's the next chapter in the ashes beneath her crown, as Alina steps deeper into the lion's den, wielding silence, suspicion, and a mind sharpened by exile. Chapter 5. Games of Deception. Vengeance does not wear a sword. It wears a smile. In court, truth was not spoken, it was performed, and Alina played her role with a grace that left no trace. Each morning, she walked the palace gardens with a book in hand, pausing beside the lilies as if she could read their silence. In the salons, she sipped tea and listened, never spoke first, but always remembered. She smiled when the others flirted with power. She whispered when they shouted, and in that stillness, she became dangerous. The court did not realize it was being watched. They saw Lady Aurelia of Northfold as a curiosity, foreign, elegant, unreadable. But they did not see her notes carefully scribed each night in a cipher only one man alive could read. Nor did they see the hidden pocket in her skirts, where she kept an ivory token, the last seal of House Virel, and they did not know she was unraveling them, one thread at a time. She started with Lady Evelini, a woman addicted to secrets. Rumor had it she once overheard a nobleman confess to poisoning his rival in the winter of '08, and had kept her status ever since by implying she might speak of it at any moment. Alina offered her a rare perfume from the Northern Isles, a scent Avellini had once paid a fortune for and lost in a customs fire. You're too kind, Avellini purred, pressing a kiss to Alina's cheek. If you ever need a whisper, come to me. Alina did, and what she learned was this. Duke Theron had been meeting in secret with someone not of noble blood, a merchant turned shadow banker, with ties to the black market and the inner guards, a man who should never have been in a position to influence a chancellor, unless he was part of the silencing. By the third week, Alina had spun threads between names and events the court had long forgotten. A fire here, a demotion there, a steward arrested on forged charges, a midwife vanished without record, all surrounding the year her parents died, all touched by one invisible hand. She needed proof, and for that, she would need access to the palace archives sealed to all but a few members of court, and under the authority of the royal recordmaster, Lord Seelan Voss. Seelan Voss was a scholar with a spine of glass and a tongue of fire. He respected no one except written law. Fortunately, he also had a weakness for flattery and beautiful distractions. Alina paid him a visit. She wore a pale lilac dress, her hair in soft braids, demure but dignified. She arrived without appointment, claiming a curiosity about the Northfold maritime treaties, and asked about them with such interest that Seelan insisted on personally walking her through the collection. He never noticed how her eyes scanned the room, not for scrolls but for the locked case in the far corner, marked Decrees Year 1108 to 1110. Those, Seelan huffed, restricted, only accessible by royal command. Alina smiled. I imagined such access would require a miracle. He laughed. Or a scandal. She returned that night dressed in shadows. Through Garen's old contacts, she secured a forged seal of royal research. Enough to pass a sleepy guard. Enough to reach the records, but not enough to afford hesitation. Inside the restricted chamber, the air was thick with old parchment and secrets no one had meant to keep. She lit a small candle, fingers trembling only slightly as she turned page after page, and then she saw it. A letter, not signed, not addressed, just 7 words. The falcon must fall for the crown to rise. Her heart stopped. Someone had written the order, and worse, it had been approved, stamped with the chancellor's seal. But before she could tuck the paper into her satchel, the door creaked, a footstep, then another. She blew out the candle and ducked behind the pillar. 2 guards entered, laughing, careless. One spoke of a late supper. The other mentioned a lady in lilac who'd caught Seelan's eye. Alina bit her tongue, willing herself still. When they left, she slipped out the back silent, invisible, but forever changed. That night, she burned the copy of the letter into her mind, not just the words, but the ink, the shape of the seal, the pressure of the quill. It was real. She had found the first true blade in her arsenal. The game had changed. Now, she would stop smiling. The truth is no longer buried. It's breathing and it has chosen her to speak. Follow From Ashes to Power for the next chapter. Alina is no longer a mystery. She is a reckoning. Absolutely. Here's the next chapter of The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, where emotional tension deepens as Alina comes face to face with a ghost from her former life, the cousin who replaced her. Chapter 6. The sister who replaced her. Some betrayals are not loud. Some come dressed in ribbons, smiling, calling you sister. She did not expect to see Eliane so soon. She had imagined it, of course, rehearsed it in mirrors and dreams, sculpted it like stone. The confrontation, the truth, the cold satisfaction of holding her gaze, knowing she had returned stronger than what they'd buried. But when it happened, it was simple. It was a garden party. The palace was hosting a mid-spring celebration for the younger nobles, a parade of chiffon and calculated flirtations. Alina arrived fashionably late, her gown seafoam green, her gloves soft cream, her smile measured. She was sipping mint cordial beneath the rose arch when she heard it. Alina of House Virel. Her chest tightened, not because of the name, but because of the ease with which it had been said, without hesitation, without question, as if Eliane had always belonged to it. Alina turned, slowly, and there she was. Eliane had grown into beauty. Her hair was a cascade of sunlight. Her gown was white silk embroidered with tiny golden falcons. She laughed easily, her arm looped through that of a minor prince. She looked like the perfect noble daughter, untouched, adored, rightful. But Alina saw past it. She saw the girl who once wept in her nursery because the governess praised Alina's drawings more. She saw the trembling hands of the cousin who had clung to her skirts during thunderstorms. She saw the last time they stood together when Eliane watched her be dragged from the estate, her lips pressed shut, her eyes full of something that wasn't sadness. They locked eyes, and for a heartbeat, the party blurred. Music faded, laughter hushed. The past roared between them. Then Eliane blinked and smiled. She approached, the way one noblewoman greets another, poised, effortless. "You must be Lady Aurelia," she said, "the one everyone is whispering about." Alina inclined her head. "Whispers are rarely accurate. I prefer truths." Eliane laughed, light and musical. "Then let me offer one. You wear mystery beautifully. And you," Alina said softly, "wear comfort even better." A flicker, there, in her eyes. Recognition. Or guilt. Maybe both. They spoke for 10 more minutes, on music, on fashion, on the cruelty of northern winters. Every word perfectly civil, perfectly meaningless. But it was war beneath silk. Eliane never mentioned the pendant she saw glinting briefly beneath Alina's scarf. Alina never asked why Eliane now bore the crest of a house that did not belong to her. They circled each other like dancers on a blade, smiling, laughing, bleeding in silence. That night, Alina returned home and stared into her mirror for a long time. She wiped off the rouge, and did the curls, stripped away the persona, and stood there, just herself, just Alina, daughter of the ones they erased, heir to nothing yet carrying everything they tried to kill. And now, Eliane had a face, a voice, a role to play. But Alina had a reason. Absolutely. Here's Chapter 7, Love Amidst Schemes, written with longer, more lyrical sentences, deeper emotional introspection, and layered tension between vengeance and the first flicker of vulnerability. This chapter introduces the emotional conflict Alina must face between the cold fire of revenge and the unfamiliar warmth of something that feels dangerously close to affection. Chapter 7, Love Amidst Schemes. When you spend your life building a weapon of yourself, love is not comfort, it is interruption. It was never part of her plan to feel something warm again. Alina had spent too many nights chiseling herself into something sharp, something composed, something no longer capable of bleeding, let alone hoping. Her grief had long since dried into resolve. Her heart, once tender, once capable of laughter and lullabies, had been folded, buried, locked behind strategy and silence. But fate, ever uninvited, has a cruel delight in sending softness into the paths of those who cannot afford it, and his name was Cassian Vale. He was not the kind of man who drew attention with polished charm or dramatic flair. He was not the loudest in the room, nor the one most eager to impress. And yet, when Alina first saw him standing quietly near the marble balustrade of the Chancellor's banquet, his gaze fixed not on people but on the slow swirl of wine in his untouched glass, she noticed him before she understood why. There was something in his stillness, a calm that did not beg to be admired, but demanded to be understood. She would not have approached him, but he did. "You don't like wine," he said simply, when she set her crystal glass down and touched. Alina raised an eyebrow, barely smiling. "Is that your opening remark? A criticism or a compliment?" "An observation," he replied, his voice low, grounded, unpretentious. "One that separates you from most of this room." She tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. "And what makes you think I wish to be separated?" He met her eyes not with the hunger of men who saw a conquest, but with the quiet clarity of someone who saw through veils for a living. "Because you already are." They spoke only briefly that night, about nothing and everything, about the absurdity of the court's obsession with peacock feathers, about the flawed geometry in one of the ceiling frescoes, about how the musicians were playing half a beat too slow. But beneath the idle chatter, something began to hum, quiet but persistent, like a distant echo of something she had once believed lost. Later, when she asked Garin who he was, the answer froze her blood mid-breath. "Cashin Vale," he said. "Grave, son of Lord Edric Vale." She remembered that name. Lord Edric Vale had served under her father in the King's Council. And on the night her family fell, he was the first to switch allegiance, the first to offer words of sympathy while secretly voting to seize their lands. And now, his son had spoken to her not as an enemy, not as a spy, but as a man who had no idea who she truly was, or perhaps too much of one. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed again and again. By accident, it seemed at first, at a gallery opening, at the stables, at a lecture on naval architecture, where Alina pretended to be mildly interested while Cashin asked a question that made even the speaker pause. He never flirted, he never pushed, but his presence, measured, observant, and unmistakably sincere, began to unnerve her far more than the predators she danced with daily, because sincerity, in a world built on masks, was a threat. One evening, under the soft golden glow of lanterns, strung between pillars at a royal charity gathering, Alina found herself beside him once more. A gentle breeze stirred the silk at her shoulders as violins sang some distant song she did not recognize. And before she could slip away as she always did, he spoke again. "Do you ever tire of it?" She turned. "Of what?" "This theater," he said, nodding toward the crowd. "This endless waltz of pretending not to see what everyone's trying so hard to show." Alina looked at him, her expression unreadable. But inside, something shifted. "Pretending," she said softly, "is the only way some of us survive." For the first time, his gaze faltered. "And is that what you're doing, Lady Aurelia? Surviving?" A beat passed. Too long, too honest. Then she smiled carefully. "Aren't we all?" That night, she walked home slower than usual. The moonlight clung to her like memory. Her gloves felt too tight, her breath too loud. She hated it, this feeling of something growing in a corner of her chest she thought long abandoned. She told herself it was a distraction, a mistake, that Cashin Vale was a thread in a different skin, that his kindness could be a trap, his gaze a calculated move. But something in her heart, small, fragile, foolish, whispered, "What if it's not?" Back in her quarters, she opened her notebook to write about alliances, archives, leads, plans, but her pen paused. Instead, she drew a single line. Just one, then she crossed it out. When revenge begins to soften, it does not ask permission. It simply enters quietly, through the one door left unguarded. But what happens when a heart dares to feel again while still carrying a blade? Follow from ashes to power as Alina faces the most dangerous question of all. Can you love and still burn everything down? With pleasure. Here's Chapter 8 of The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, written with long, atmospheric sentences and an emotional undercurrent of tension, betrayal, and sudden danger. In this chapter, Alina makes her first daring move only to discover that someone she trusted may already be working against her. Chapter 8. The night of betrayal. Betrayal never announces itself with a sword. It arrives with quiet footsteps and a familiar voice. The night had been chosen with precision. Moonless, windless, quiet. Alina had waited for weeks, weaving her web through ballrooms and reading rooms, dropping hints in idle conversations, tugging carefully at the threads of vanity and ambition that bound the powerful together like poorly stitched seams. She had planted a rumor in the right ear that Duke Theron had secured illegal access to royal lands in exchange for gold from the shadow markets. It was just close enough to the truth to feel believable, and just distant enough to keep her hands clean. And then she waited for it to fester. By the time the royal inspectors were summoned to investigate the Duke's holdings on the outskirts of Marrow Hill, whispers had already begun to slither through the court: misuse of crown property, forged land grants, servants gone missing. And at the center of it all, of course, was Theron's signature. It should have been a clean blow, not fatal, but visible, enough to stain him, enough to expose the cracks, but it was too clean, too easy. And as Alina watched the council chamber, from behind the privacy veil of a marble colonnade, something inside her coiled. She saw Duke Theron unshaken, composed, even amused as the accusations were read aloud by Lord Seelan, and then he smiled. Not the strained smile of a man cornered, but the smirk of a man who saw the trap coming and turned it inside out. "There has been a forgery," Theron said calmly, producing his own sealed scroll. "But not by me. I received an anonymous warning 2 nights ago. Someone has been impersonating royal voices. Someone with access to forged documents and dangerous intent." He paused, then looked directly at her, not at Lady Aurelia, at her. As if he knew. The chamber erupted. Investigators murmured. Council members exchanged glances. Someone mentioned Garen's name. Someone else questioned the authenticity of several documents that had recently surfaced. And Alina, hidden in shadow, felt the first crack in the mirror she had so carefully polished. It wasn't the exposure that frightened her. It was the realization that someone had warned him. Someone had betrayed her. She fled the council building. Before the meeting adjourned, her cloak drawn tight, her steps swift and silent through the narrow side alleys of the capital. The wind had picked up, sharp and sudden, as if the world itself had caught its breath. At Garen's safe house, the lights were out, the lock on the door was broken, and the rooms inside emptied. She moved like instinct, not home, not her rented quarters, not the inn where her forged identity might be traced. She ran into the warehouse district, toward the river, where night swallowed sound and the guards only patrolled for smugglers. There, in the abandoned shipping office Garen had once shown her, she lit a single lantern and waited. Her pulse was a drum, her thoughts louder. Who knew? The question spun like a blade in her mind. She had told no one, shared nothing, except Cashin. But no, he didn't know enough. And Eliane, too careful, too proud. But pride could make people careless. Or maybe, Garen himself. The thought gutted her. At midnight, a shadow moved by the door. Alina rose, dagger in hand, but it was not a guard, not an assassin. It was a figure cloaked in gray, half hidden by darkness. "Who sent you?" she asked, voice low and steady. The figure stepped forward, revealing the face of a palace maid, one who had once delivered her letters. Trembling, eyes wide, "I came to warn you," the girl whispered. "They know." Alina's heart pounded. "Who told them?" "I don't know, but there's a warrant. They're searching for you, not as Lady Aurelia, as a fraud. They're saying you're not who you claim to be, that you're something else." The girl dropped a folded paper. Alina opened it. No signature, just a message. "You overplayed your hand, Falcon. The crown remembers. You should have stayed buried." Alina stood frozen, not with fear, but with clarity. This was no longer a game of subtlety. They wanted her gone, not ruined, not exposed, erased. She burned the note, took only what she could carry, changed into a black riding cloak and slipped into the night like smoke escaping a house already aflame. And as the wind howled behind her, chilling, unrelenting, she did not tremble. She had been betrayed, yes, but she was still breathing. And that meant only one thing. They hadn't won. Betrayal is not the end. It is the spark. The fire has begun, and now, the shadows she once used to hide will become the ones she commands. Follow from ashes to power as Alina rises, this time without mercy. "I'm so glad you're loving it. This is the turning point." Here's chapter 9 of The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, where Alina emerges from betrayal more dangerous than ever, and long-buried truths finally claw their way into the light. Chapter 9. Flames and revelations. You can bury a name, but not the blood it carries. Truth burns even in silence, and fire always finds a way. They thought she would run. They thought fear would send her back to exile, to shadows, to forgotten corners where ghosts go to rot. But Alina had lived in silence before. She had worn grief like a second skin. And she had survived betrayal so intimate, it had once stolen the shape of her own reflection. So no, she would not run, she would rise, and she would bring the reckoning they thought they'd buried. It began not with fire, but with ink. 3 nights after the warrant was issued, a letter appeared unsigned, unstamped, slipped beneath the doors of 5 key noble households. Then 5 more, then 10. Within 2 days, the whispers had become tremors. Within a week, the tremors turned to panic, because what the letters said was not vague. It was not suggestion or scandal. It was truth, a recounting of the council vote that stripped House Virel of its lands, a copy of the forged decree bearing Duke Theron's seal, a list of royal servants who disappeared in the days before the fire, names long forgotten, now resurrected in black ink. No signature, only a symbol pressed in wax, a falcon in flight, wings ablaze. In the palace, they called it treason. In the streets, they called it justice, and in the darkened libraries of the capital, where scholars and clerks gathered in whispered curiosity, they began calling it something else. The return. Eliane was the first to show signs of fracture. She arrived late to her luncheon, pale, distracted. Her voice, once lilting and smug, faltered as she spoke of lies and conspiracies. When pressed, she claimed it was the work of a vengeful impostor, someone trying to sully the family's name. But she was not convincing. Not when the court had already begun comparing timelines. Not when portraits of the real Alina, long removed, long erased, were quietly retrieved from the historical records, and certainly not when one of the king's own archivists disappeared the morning after he received a falcon-sealed letter. Cashin found her first, not in the palaces or the salons, but on the cliffs of Izmir, where the sea crashed against stone like memory against bone. "You started the fire," he said quietly, no accusation in his voice. She did not turn. "No, I only removed the curtain." The fire was already there. He stepped closer, his coat billowing in the wind. "You've put yourself in danger." She laughed, bitter and soft. "I was born in danger. You're just finally seeing it." A pause. Then lower. "You should have told me." She turned then, slowly. Her eyes met his, raw and unflinching. "Would you have believed me?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I would have stood beside you." Those words, so simple, so undeserved, cut deeper than the betrayals. And that was what frightened her most. 2 days later, the council met in emergency session. There was no avoiding it now. The evidence had become a flood. Servants began speaking, those who had been paid to forget, who now came forward with trembling lips and names they had not dared utter in years. And then came the steward, an older man, gray beard, quiet eyes, limp in one leg. He entered the chamber and laid before them the original ledger of House Virel, unaltered, untouched. He said only one thing: "I served the falcon. I watched them fall, and I watched the man who pushed them." He pointed to the chancellor. Theron rose, calm, elegant, serpentine. "This is a campaign of lies," he said. "Forged documents, fear tactics, an illusion spun by someone who should not even exist." But he was sweating, and the nobles saw it, because beneath all his denial was silence, the kind that only exists when the truth has arrived too loud to bury. Alina did not attend the trial. She did not need to. She stood on the rooftop of the East Tower, wind wrapping around her like a second cloak, watching as the palace guards carried away the man who had once eulogized her father with false tears. And she felt, not victory, not yet, only the beginning of something that finally felt real. Chapter 10. The hidden enemy. The serpent you kill is never the only one in the garden. The city celebrated. Candles were lit in the streets. Wine was poured in every inn and alley. The fall of Chancellor Theron was seen as a cleansing and overdue purge, a long-awaited justice. But Alina did not celebrate, because she had felt it, the absence behind the collapse. Theron had fallen too easily, his confessions too controlled, his panic too polished. It was as if he had known the fall was coming, and had chosen to take the blow. To protect someone else. In the days after his sentencing, Alina withdrew from the public eye. She knew how fragile public favor was, how quickly a heroine could become a heretic. She stayed in Garen's rebuilt safe house, now hidden behind the facade of a rare bookseller. There, with only candlelight, silence, and her notebooks, she retraced every step, every word, every signature, until one pattern began to emerge. A name: Lord Maven Rylance. He had been a shadow in the background for years, never loud, never decorated, but always present, on every committee that mattered, on every financial council, present at the vote to dismantle House Virel though his vote had been abstention, present during Theron's first rise to power though credited nothing, present in the king's chambers during illness though not a physician, always present, but never questioned. Alina brought it to Garen first. He said nothing at first, only rubbed a hand down his weary face, then spoke in a voice lined with years of buried knowledge. Rylance is not a man, he said softly. He's a net, a construct, a way for the real seat of power to breathe without being seen. I don't understand. Garen looked at her. You were chasing the arrow, child, not the hand that drew the bow. She sat with that thought for hours, and when she stood again, she felt older, not in years but in understanding. Because justice had not yet been done, she had pulled back a curtain only to find a larger one behind it, and the man who stood there had no face. She began investigating Maven Rylance the only way she could through the dead. She sought out widows of advisors who died quietly. She paid visits to retired footmen and stewards who remembered who entered which doors and when. She found an old painter, now blind, who had once been commissioned to sketch a council dinner portrait, then told to destroy it the day after, but he had kept it, and in that painting, Alina saw what she needed, Maven Rylance standing to steps behind the king, not Theron. And yet, in every public record, Rylance had always been second to Theron, a footnote, a scribe, a man without ambition. But the men without ambition are often the most dangerous, because they don't want the crown, they want to control the hand that wears it. She had to see him. To know for herself what kind of man could orchestrate the destruction of a noble house and remain untouchable. The invitation came surprisingly easily, a reception at the Hall of the Meridian Arts, honoring political stability. Rylance, they said, would be in attendance, not in front, not giving a speech, but sitting behind the curtains, watching. She wore black that night, not for mourning, but for warning, and when she entered the marble atrium, flanked by gilded statues and low music, she felt his eyes on her before she saw his face. He was older than she expected, silver-haired, slender, elegant in the way a dagger is elegant, clean, efficient, beautiful only if you don't know what it does. He watched her from across the room as if she were a page in a book he'd already read, but didn't mind revisiting. When she approached, he smiled, but it did not touch his eyes. Lady Aurelia, he said, offering no title of his own. Or should I say, Alina Virel? She did not blink. Say whichever you prefer. One is my name, the other is my purpose. He laughed gently, as if her fire amused him. Purpose is a dangerous thing for a woman to have in a city built on men's forgetfulness. She met his gaze head on. And forgetfulness, she said, is a dangerous thing to underestimate. Their conversation lasted no more than 4 minutes, but by the end of it, she knew. He had known of her escape, her investigations, her letters. He had let her tear down Theron because it served him. Now he watched to see if she would be useful, or if she would need to be silenced again, and Alina walked away from that conversation with one certainty. The true war had just begun, of course. Here's chapter 11 of The Ashes Beneath Her Crown, written in a more lyrical, emotionally saturated, and sentence-rich style. In this pivotal chapter, Alina steps into the lion's den not with fear, but with the composure of a woman who has learned to wrap grief in steel. Her voice rises, not only for her parents but for every truth the crown chose to forget. Chapter 11, Justice in the Crown's Name. There comes a moment when silence must become a sword. The day she walked through the gates of the royal court, the sky was not mourning. It was radiant, a contradiction so cruel it nearly made her laugh because grief, when worn for too long, begins to blend with grace, and the sun does not dim for what has been lost, only the heart does. She had imagined this moment 100 times, her return, her reckoning, her voice finally echoing where once it had been silenced, but no amount of imagining could prepare the body for what the soul had rehearsed in solitude. The gates, tall and iron-veined, parted without protest. Her name, Alina Virel, was spoken aloud for the first time within palace walls in over a decade, and the sound of it seemed to stretch across the marble floor like a shadow returning to its rightful form. They stared, of course, some with curiosity, some with doubt, some with the dull recognition of guilt that had been long buried and now stirred again beneath polished shoes and powdered silence. She passed them all, a procession of fear disguised as etiquette. The throne room was colder than she remembered, Or perhaps it had always been this cold, and only now, without the warmth of innocence, could she feel its sharpness. The floor shone too brightly. The windows bled too much light. And at the far end, beneath a canopy of gold-stitched velvet, sat the king, aged now, soft around the eyes, wearier than the last time she'd seen him. He had once called her little falcon. Now he said nothing. Perhaps he didn't recognize the fire he had unknowingly helped create. She did not kneel, not in arrogance, but in truth. You do not kneel before a crown that watched your family burn and did not ask where the ashes fell. I come not as a subject, she said, her voice unwavering despite the hollowness that opened inside her chest, but as a daughter, a witness, and a survivor of a crime committed in your name. The silence that followed was thick, reluctant, as if the air itself was ashamed. A few noblemen shifted. Others frowned. The king's advisor leaned forward, Maven Rylance, ever watchful, ever unreadable, his hands folded like a man already predicting the ending of a story he once wrote in secret. Alina stepped further into the center of the room, her cloak trailing behind her like the tail of a storm. I speak for House Virel, she said, the words heavier than stone. Erased without trial, condemned without evidence, their land seized, their name slandered, their heir me dragged into darkness and left there to rot under silence and stolen breath. The king finally stirred. His voice was not cruel, only old. Why come now, child? And her answer was soft but carried like thunder through the high arched chamber. Because now, I can. She presented the scroll's original, unaltered, preserved with the precision of a woman who understood how fragile truth could become when held too long. She spoke each name, each date, each lie. She laid bare the ledger of betrayal in front of a crown that had slept through its own corruption. When she was done, she did not cry, because crying was for mourning, and this day was not about mourning. It was about remembering loudly, clearly, and without apology. Rylance rose. For the first time, his voice was smooth, polished like marble, shaped not to soothe but to deflect. What she offers, he said, gesturing toward the parchment, is an old tale, a bitter memory turned into spectacle. How do we know this is not the invention of a woman raised in exile, taught to hate? Alina turned slowly. She did not raise her voice. She did not burn with rage. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a single object on the marble floor between them. Her father's seal, charred, cracked but intact, the symbol of a house destroyed, the symbol of a truth too stubborn to die. Because lies decay, she said. But some things, some names are carved so deep into blood that not even fire can consume them. The chamber held its breath, and in that silence, the king stood, slowly, carefully, as though rising from a throne that had grown heavier with every year of forgotten justice. He took the seal, he looked at Alina, and for the first time in over a decade, he said the name, Virel. And with that, the weight of 12 years shifted. Alina was offered restoration, title, land, wealth, but she refused the court's invitation to stay. I do not wish to sit where I was never meant to kneel, she said. Give me what was stolen, nothing more. Chapter 12. A quiet garden, a peaceful heart. She did not want a throne. She only wanted her name back and the silence to finally hear it without pain. The palace faded behind her like a dream she was never meant to stay inside. Alina did not look back, not because there was nothing worth remembering, but because the fire that once pulled her forward had finally softened, not extinguished, but transformed into a quiet, steady glow that no longer sought to burn, only to warm. She left with no parade, no farewell speech, no promises, just a letter, folded once, left in the king's chamber. It said only this: thank you for listening. That is more than most did. She traveled west, past the cities and their mirrors, past the towns where her name now drifted on the breeze like a ghost finally made whole. She walked through hills scented with rosemary and ash, through forests that did not ask for stories, and finally she reached the place she had dreamed of in the silence of the convent nights, a little manor, overgrown, untouched, waiting. The land had once belonged to her mother, a gift from an old queen, forgotten by history, tucked in a corner of the kingdom. No one fought over. And here, the world was different. The air was slower, the soil softer, birds sang, not for ceremony, but because no one had told them not to. And Alina, no longer Lady Aurelia, no longer the exiled girl, no longer the girl made of secrets and vengeance, began again, not with fire, but with water, with earth, with silence. She planted a garden, not a noble one, with trimmed hedges and statues, but a true garden, wild and unruly and honest. She planted lavender for sleep, thyme for strength, and marigolds for memory. She left room for the weeds. She did not fear them, because now she understood. Not all things that grow without permission are enemies. Cashin came to visit. Weeks later, he stood at her gate like someone unsure if he still belonged in her story. He didn't bring flowers, only a book of poems and a loaf of dark rye bread. I didn't come to stay, he said quietly. I didn't ask you to, she replied, but when she turned to go back inside, she left the door open behind her. He stepped through, slowly, carefully, as though entering not a house, but a life he was willing to learn gently. Some days they worked in the soil together. Some days they did not speak at all. But that was the thing about peace. It didn't need proof. It didn't need names. It only needed presence. And for the first time in years, Alina allowed herself to rest. To rise with the sun and not with dread. To read without fear. To sleep without dreams of burning. To be not the survivor, not the avenger, just the girl who grew again. In the back of the garden stood a single stone, small, unmarked, but every morning, she placed a single bloom on it, for her father, for her mother, for the name they gave her, not because she was mourning, but because she remembered, and remembering without pain was the most powerful freedom of all. If you've walked with her this far, thank you. Not all stories end in thrones and revenge. Some end in a quiet garden, a peaceful heart, a name reclaimed, and a life finally, truly her own. Subscribe to From Ashes to Power, and remember, even from the deepest ruin, something gentle can bloom.